Okay, today let's look at a few things that are different than what we're taught. Most people know that Galileo was the guy that was supposedly the first one to come up with a heliocentric model, and that's not actually the truth. Though the church didn't like it because they had us being supposedly in the center of the universe and it's all about us, and there was this dome over the earth and little pinholes in that, like we were trapped inside of a tin covered area that had a roof, or the firmament idea, and the little pinholes that were in that were angels and stars and all kinds of things like that, and therefore we're the center of everything and we're just spinning like a ball. It's not actually true, though, and we of course know that nowadays. But the first one that ever showed this was a Greek of the time, and so uh, Aristarchus of Samos. And the reason the Greeks rejected the idea is because they had no idea that the universe, or even our solar system, was quite as big that it is actually. And they thought there would be a parallax type of event to where whenever you went to different places around on the planet, the constellations and everything would morph and change a whole lot. Kind of like when you're looking out a car window going down the road and you actually see that real close to you all the trees are moving by and everything real fast, but in the distance it doesn't. And if you're ever looking at an airplane flying, it looks like it's almost standing still at a far distance to you. Well, if you imagine that where it went 93 million miles, it would really be standing still a whole lot more, right? Parallax multiplies as it goes far away. And they didn't believe that the cosmos at that time was near as vast as it actually is. In fact, at some point back in through there, those people that are making decisions on whether this is true or not did not believe that our solar system and our Milky Way galaxy was just one of millions of galaxies. They didn't have real advanced telescopes and things like that be able to detect the difference. Hopefully you're following me. So they rejected that idea because they thought everything should change a whole lot. But here's one for you. The ancient Phoenicians knew that the constellations changed versus what is level on our planet, and they used that in their maritime navigation and so on, and other people did through time, knowing that that was the truth versus what these biblical people were thinking at the time. Now, you're taught that he had this heliocentric model first, but again, I'm showing you that's not true. This was somewhere around 300 BC that he had this figured out, but it was rejected by the Greeks. Not too far before this, they thought that because whenever you look at the sun at noon, it was a little smaller in size than it was at the horizon, using our atmosphere as a lensing effect, and so a sunset and a sunrise looks just a little bigger. So they thought that the sun rose and set in the far east and the far west. In fact, I've told you before that the ancient mythology that goes along with Ethiopians, which is where we get the name, the Greeks coined the word. They were supposedly people that were Caucasians, by the way, that lived at the far east and the far west of the known world, where the sun rises and sets. And because the sun gets so much closer to them at the far east and the far west, which was over past India and the top of North Africa, that they got a whole lot more tanned because of this effect. Not the effect that we naturally tan from being out in the sun. And so that's where these sunburnt faces connotations come from with that. It never had anything to do with a southern people until the well-known and documented mistakes of Herodotus, where he was told, and never actually saw these people, that lived up the Nile past the Egyptians, who were a southern people, and not a people in the far east and the far west, who were closer to the sun as it rose and set at the ends of the earth, which is showing you the vast expanse of where these Caucasian people were at the time. And so he made a mistake there in that. In fact, when the Greeks actually went to far northwest Africa to find and meet with these people that was part of their mythology, all they found there were pale Caucasians, very much like themselves, many of which had blonde and red hair and so on, and some still do in that area, known as the Amazigh people. But when they figured out that those people weren't sunburnt faces, and whenever they went there, there was the same effect of the sun looking wider, but they're all the way over there, so it should look a whole lot bigger, but it didn't. In fact, they could measure it and say that it didn't. So a new term was coined called leucoethiops, which means white Ethiopians, because that's all they found there, and not sunburnt faced people that were close to where the sun rose and set. So hopefully you followed me through that. Would you like to hear another couple of mistakes of Herodotus in his famed histories? You know, he's looked at as being the father of histories, but he's also the father of hearsay, because he took what a lot of people said, and quite often he would say, they say this or they say that, and I don't believe it, but this is what they say, and things like that through it. If you've ever read Herodotus' histories, it's quite weird. Some of the things came up. So I'll give you a couple of examples here real quick, and then I'll go on to the next part of this. Herodotus also said that the people of India acquired their gold because there were giant ants the size of large dogs that, in the process of excavating their burrows out, like an ant mound, that they would excavate out gold and just leave it right there lying on the surface. So it seemed like it was easy to grab, but the problem was that these giant ants that were supposedly the size of dogs could outrun any man, and even outrun camels and take them down and kill them. Now, I think that we know in our modern days that there's never been any ants the size of giant dogs, situations like that, right? Hopefully we're at least to that point, people. But we're way past that point in actuality. So this was one of those hearsays where it was wrong. Just like the Ethiopians were never called Ethiopians until after the 1940s. Look into it. It was called Abyssinia until the 1940s, where all of a sudden they changed to be Ethiopians because of this. And it's looked at it as the reason that they were never called Ethiopians before is because A, they weren't the people that we're talking about, and Caucasians living at the far east and the far west of the known world where the sun rises and sets. It never had anything to do with a deeply southern people that were near the equator. So it wasn't renamed until the 1940s. In fact, that's kind of a political propaganda type thing that's pushed on people today, but it didn't happen until the 1940s. Okay, let's move on now to another thing about Earth and all of its things that go in there. The first person to suggest that the Earth was a sphere is supposedly way in the future of when it actually happened. But it happened in ancient Greece too, and it was Aristotle. And he said that the Earth was a sphere, and we were spinning kind of like a basketball on your finger, right? And that the sun didn't actually rise and set, it just appeared to, because we're spinning versus the sun, who is sitting in the center of our solar system. And so it looks to us like it's coming up and going down, like all the mythologies with the chariots and taking the sun across the sky and things that people thought back in this time. But he said that's not really true. It's really more like this, as opposed, of course, to the heliocentric model, or at showing you the heliocentric model again. And so he was ridiculed on that too at the time of it, because people were like, well, we're not spinning because we'd be able to tell that we're spinning. People that are flat earthers to this day cannot believe the concept that we're spinning at over 1,000 miles an hour and stuff, and that all the water on Earth doesn't fly away and stuff. Well, it's a gigantic planet in comparison to what you think. And if you think that, look at something like Jupiter, or these giant planets, or the sun, which is much, much bigger, and what it would seem like, and what it would do, and what gravity you'd be able to hold on to. But there's still flat earthers to this day, which really I have a mental issue with, but they get debunked constantly on that. But let's get on past that point. But that was Aristotle. And he said the earth was a sphere. And you can look at old maps, and it shows you a flat disk in the Sumerians, and it shows there's water all around this giant landmass that they lived on, which would have been Eurasia at the time. And they don't record sub-Saharan Africa or the point of Africa in any way, or below the Sahara. In fact, all the Greek maps that you look at to this day will show you that back then they didn't even know that that existed. But people took that idea and a few others thinking that it was flat. And the Bible says that it's placed up on 4 pillars and all this type of thing. And if people thought through that better, they would realize that we're actually on a planet. There's an ancient Sumerian tablet that says that the stars in our sky are like our sun, but like a torch in the distance far, far away. And that's the reality of it. Because the little planets aren't glowing in any way, it's just suns. So every star we see is a sun like our own, but instead of being big around us, like a quarter held at arm's length here, and about the same size as the moon, in respective, because it's 400 times closer to us, but 400 times larger the sun is, and so it makes about correct representation for eclipses to happen. Most people understand this, hopefully. But I remember being a kid and watching Carl Sagan and his series on Cosmos. Do you remember this? It was pretty cool. He acted like he was in a futuristic spaceship going around and doing all types of things, but then explaining things out to you. And one of the things that really caught me was whenever he showed that Eratosthenes of Cyrene, which is down in Egypt area, heard that way up the Nile towards the equator, that this one well during the longest day of the year didn't cast any shadow inside of itself in any way. In fact, it was perfectly lit in there, and it was one way for them to tell whenever they were at the summer solstice area, the summer pinpoint, which was like the 21st of June, and it's what we still have today. In fact, the 21st of May is the equinox, and the later equinox is later in the year. And December 21st is looked to be the winter equinox, but for 3 days you can't tell the difference between it. It doesn't seem to move at all, and then 3 days later it does. And of course, this is the ancient tale where Jesus, looked as a sun god, has this effect where somewhere near, looking from there, and you can only see it from a southern point, there's a constellation known as the Southern Cross. And so this sun that we have was the son of the gods, right? So the Son of God, S-U-N, dies every year on December 21st on the cross, or the Southern Cross, and 3 days later he rises again to save all humanity from a Ice Age winter. So that's a little bit different than you think, but that sure does sound familiar, doesn't it? Anyhow, on Carl Sagan's show, he showed Eratosthenes, and what he did was he did a simple measurement counting where he thought the earth was round too, and so he had somebody walk from all the way in North Egypt all the way to Syene and make sure this happened, and then to double check himself he had him walk all the way back and wanted to know how many paces there were. Now, by the way, a mile, do you know where a mile comes from? A mile is 1,000 paces, because a normal human pace, and of course it varies a little, but then you start to get an average due to human height. Measurements were recorded that way, just like cubits were the forearm and so on. And 1,000 paces equal a mile, which are really about 5.28, just a hair below 5.3, and that's how we get 5,280 feet make the mile. Are you following me? Okay, so he had somebody pace this out, and it roughly came out to around 8,000 paces there and 8,000 paces back, and he took the average of the two and said, okay, if it's 8,000 miles and everything here, let me look at the longest day of the year. And he took and plumbed directly vertical, perfectly vertical, a pole, and then saw on the longest day of the year there was a shadow. Not like in Syene where they had no shadow, but there was a definite shadow, but it wasn't that much. And he figured out that it was 8.2%, somewhere around in there. Don't quote me on this, but in doing so, he was like, okay, so if I go 800 miles and it ends up showing this amount, if I was to say the Earth is 365 degrees, that comes from the Sumerian math, by the way. That's how we get the size of a sphere and things like that, that the whole world would roughly be about this big around in circumference. And he really wasn't off by too much. It's, what is it, less than 1,000 miles that he was off on the whole thing, or just a hair over 1,000 miles, somewhere in that range. And that could be off by just a little bit, and that guy's pacing and so on. But he utilized that, and he found out that the Earth was round, but not only that, the size of the Earth. And so some people are told that that's where we knew it from, and that we knew it much earlier. So these people that thought that Columbus was going to fall off the edge of a flat Earth whenever he tried to go to India that way, because it couldn't go around the Earth because the Earth isn't round or whatever. Well, we know that that's all fake too. I mean, people take plane rides over to the Orient that way, and you can go this way and go all the way across Europe and Asia, and then there it is. And so whenever he wanted to make that, he actually knew the truth of it, Columbus, whatever, because he was trying to find a way to go around, and instead of going that way and having to go around the Horn of Africa and all that to make it to there, he went the other way. Are you following me? Well, here's one for you. I've shown in Sacred Geometry, and you can find Carlton showing you this same type of effect, and about 20 other guys at least. But Randall Carlson, by the way, and I've showed a few of his things on Sacred Geometry. In fact, one of the ones I show is the connection of the Egyptian pyramid to the size of the Earth. And what's crazy about that is that it seemingly, and I'd like for you to look up my video, I don't want to have to go into all of it right now, but the Great Pyramid is a little bit more squat in height than it is in its circumference around the edges of the base of it. And that is the same representation on how the Earth is an oblate spheroid and a little bigger around the middle than it is if you went a piece of tape not around the middle horizontally, but you were to go vertically and go around North Pole, South Pole. And it's exactly that representation. And people look at this and they try to say, oh, that's just a coincidence or whatever. Including the socle that's there and where they had the outside casing on the pyramid and its original height versus its original width. It shows you that it's the exact same thing. But it also shows you that they knew where the longitude and latitude was at that time where they were, because that's showing you a demarcation of the longitude and latitude that they're at. Look at my video. Randall goes into it. I go into it a little deeper when I talk about it and so on. But if you've looked at any of sacred geometry or any of my videos on it, it shows you that 432 is a solar number, and it goes with the sizing of many things. It's a key number in sacred geometry, and 432,000 is also, and that can be found in the Sumerians kings list when you add it all up, because they've got these kings before the flood, and they show you people living 22 and 38,000 and all these different numbers, and that's really sacred geometry numbers. And what did they know? Well, the Egyptians showed that when they made the pyramids, right at their earliest dynasties, they knew all of this. And the architect of the Great Pyramid, known as Hemwenu, which I'll show you a picture of here, you can easily tell it's a Caucasian person and probably had blue eyes and so on like that, like most of the nobility and stuff of the earliest dynasties and even pre-dynastic Egyptians had, all the way through. In fact, they've looked at the genetics of them, and they don't change very much all the way until post-Roman times, and the big change happens after that when Arabic influx comes in, who they had something to do with the trans-Saharan slave trade and became quite admixed, and then so that admix came into it, and so it's kind of the opposite exactly of what Afrocentrics try to say, where they realize that the genetics no longer match the ancients, and it happened in post-Roman times, and it's because of sub-Saharan admix that finally shows up at the end that was never there in the past. I've done other videos that showing blonde and red-haired Egyptians and so on too, so it shows you a connection of who these people were that were connected. But also the Sumerians show blue-eyed statues and so on too, and you can find that in Levant and Anatolia and so on like that too. But in that sacred geometry video, which I'd like for you to look up, you can look up sacred geometry on my channel, and you'll see, oh, I don't know what, 14 videos. Well, some of them are 2 and 3 parters and so on too, so it adds up well over 20, almost 30 videos total on it. But you can find where I show even one time where Randall Carlson shows this, and he shows the numbers and so on, and that shows the most accurate representation of the size of the Earth. And this is thousands of years before Aristotle and Eratosthenes and so on, that the Egyptians put it into the Great Pyramid at the longitude that it was at, which is a percentage of the web that we put around the Earth, and we look at things like longitude and latitude to this day. And of course, again, people try to write this off like some kind of coincidence, and it's like, if there was just one showing, it would be more of a coincidence, but they show the size of the Earth and showing you the difference of it in thickness versus around the middle versus the height of it. And on that same declination of longitude and latitude and so on like that. And then if that number was just some weird odd number, that might be it, but yet it's 432,000, And that's a sacred geometry number that's shown in the ancient Sumerians and in the Aryans that put up Sanskrit with India and their declamation of the yugas that are there. And it's directly attached to that. And this whole thing about time and space and size. And they knew the basic size of the earth at that time, and a more accurate representation than even Eratosthenes had come up with. And that's another amazing thing about the Great Pyramid. And you get taught all kinds of things just from well, they thought the pyramid was a good structure, so they just built something that looked like a triangle, da da da. And they, of course, are making it into an 8-planed surface where you've seen, hopefully, pictures of it, where you can see on the equinoxes that there's actually a dent in on either side of it there, showing you not just 4 corners, but in between each, and so on. And these ancient Egyptians knew far more than people give credit for. And it all has to do with this extremely advanced math. I did a little short about advanced math, and I tried to make a mention of a few things in a 1-minute short that I had there, and talking about the Sumerians and so on too. But that definitely predates any of this Greek things. And of course they talked about finding about it in the Library of Alexandria. But then their applied knowledge wasn't even as accurate as this had come thousands of years before. And one of the biggest monuments on our planet here, the Great Pyramid, shows you this same effect, same sizing, and so on. And if you take and divide it by 432,000, it is the most accurate representation of the Earth as far as width versus its height, the same as our planet actually is. And we didn't get better than that until the satellites started looking at it, and it wasn't far off, but just by a skosh. In fact, the bulge of the Earth, due to the tides that happens on the water, is within the margins of failure there. So every time you measure, you're going to get something different unless you catch the bulge of the Earth on the other side and you're willing to go with that, and that would be the lowest number. And if you cut the bulge on a side, it was on the left or right, effectively making the bulge bigger, you could say, well, it's as big as this or this due to the bulge. It's caused by the moon, caused by the tides, and so on. And the person that invented this again and put it into there is the architect of the Great Pyramid, Humwenu. And he's said to be the greatest of 5 of Thoth. And Thoth was the god of wisdom and so on here of the ancient Egyptians, and is hooked up to Taautus the Phoenician, and then Hermes, Trismegistus, 3 times. Well, where do you get that 3 times from? Well, are we going to say it's Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Greeks? Are we going to pull that all together and leave out the Sumerians? It's kind of a strange theory, but it's amazing how we're taught that this is what the people all thought, but we knew about it way earlier because of these Greeks. And then when you look into it deeper, you're like, that's not true. They knew about it way before when. But they don't want to give anybody credit for that. And I believe that had a lot to do with the Bible, because the Bible's trying to say the earth is just 6,000 years old. So how do these people right off the bat have all this? Well, hopefully people listening to this know that the earth is not only 6,000 years old. And there were dinosaurs, and dinosaurs weren't Jesus horses, if you will. And you have an understanding now of the length of time and everything. And this is all Caucasian mythology, where the people of this time were trying to figure out, what everything is. And them occasionally finding dinosaur bones made them think of giants and the gods and the titans, if you will. And they find a leg bone of a mammoth or a brontosaurus, for God's sake, and then say, well, that kind of looks like one of our leg bones, but it's tall as I am, so They must have been 60 feet tall gods and giant things like that. And that is woven into their mythologies there. But that's just those bones. Just like dragons seem to come from them finding things like T-Rexes or dinosaur heads. And there are vases that show you this exact fact in Greece. And they had this dinosaur head there. And they're doing this ritual with it and everything. It's hooked up to it. It's also the reason that they thought a Triceratops type dinosaur was actually the griffin of the ancients and so on. And this all hooks up to Proto-Indo-Europeans that had this mythology that's going all on with it. And I made a video about it that Craig and Ford had shown, where they can peer back through time and say, where did this come from, where did that come from, and so on. And the original mythologies that others after that, including the Sumerians, Greeks, and then even the Bible, which comes much later, by the way, is all based upon things that Proto-Indo-Europeans had come up with much earlier, and they can't really go past that. I mean, you get to the point where we're going into caveman times here, well into the last ice age, and they can only make some ideal that it was about this time, knowing where certain people migrated to and then came up with this and came up with that, which is a variation on a theme, if you follow me. You can watch my video on that too, and it'll show you the truth and reality of where a lot of this Caucasian mythology came from. And by the way, the Bible doesn't talk about Oriental people, doesn't talk about Eskimos, Amerindians, the other side of the earth, black people in any way. And yeah, there's a mention in the book about Ethiopians, but then again, that's about the Ethiopians that lived in the far east and the far west of the known world, where the sun rises and sets. Hence that sunburnt faces idea. So I'll try to attach some good pictures to this and give you some type of example, but I don't want to go too deep onto it with that and flipping a bunch of pictures. But in truth and reality, we're looking back and saying, well, it came before and it was these people. And if you get into it deep, that may be all you get to know about. But in reality, it's something a whole lot deeper than that. It goes back much further. In fact, they knew a whole lot more and were a little more accurate about it in the Sumerians, who had advanced trigonometry with a Plimpton tablet. Look it up. Or the sacred geometry of the Great Pyramid itself. And, people ask, why did they build something like that? Why did they do this and that? Well, we're just now figuring out the knowledge that they knew at this time. And it's pretty much amazing. It wasn't like, duh, we're just building a little triangle that looks like a four-sided dice in Dungeons and Dragons. We have a lot of this sacred geometry. In fact, all those dice in Dungeons and Dragons, I've done a video about this, are hooked up to sacred geometry shapes, and the shapes of elements and everything that the Greeks are attributed to. But that goes back much earlier than that too. And the flower of life that you can find in Egypt and other places, and it shows you this common thing that's held between all of these people. Anyhow, like, share, and subscribe if you're not already, and check that you're still subscribed for new videos coming out and everything else, because occasionally YouTube just throws it off of there, and I'm in the process of starting to make more videos about it now. But to be truth about it, Galileo and so on weren't the first people to come up with a heliocentric model. In fact, finding out the shape of the earth wasn't something that Eratosthenes that came up. In fact, knowing the earth was a sphere was not what Aristotle had came up with. And in fact, you can look at the Great Pyramids and sacred geometry, put two and two together, and realize that they knew a lot more back in the day. Y'all have a good one. Peace.